Where do you want to go? Or about like meat blocks and people getting more mentally stressed out.
Yeah, so I think for a lot of people, because at least the way that I do meat blocks, I always am looking for a pretty successful formula in general when I'm programming, right? So I don't really change things going into a comp. If anything, there may be some kind of minor taper the last week that we tack on, but for the most time, or for most times, blocks are pretty similar. I think the idea that your peaking block needs to be this magically differently structured block, I don't know. I think it's a little outdated. I think some people still kind of do it that way, but I don't. But what I do think ends up happening is that a lot of lifters, because they're approaching competition, they stress themselves out. And as a result of that, sometimes you do need to adjust compared to your normal strategy. So I don't know. I like a week to week approach as far as programming goes for that just because of it. Most of the time it ends up working out the same, but every so often there will be a lift that's just like not behaving how it normally does. And I think that that type of strategy kind of covers it based on that.
Yeah, I mean, I know exactly what you're talking about. It's always a joke between Eric and I of like, oh, like he's like, if you have any questions, like just text me. I'm like, well, I'm not in prep, so I'll probably be like fine. I'm not in that last block. I think especially like for some reason, like in my head mentally, like even if I had like a range and I know like the range is the goal, like not a certain number. If I have to take like the low end on like 1 week going into meet, I'm like, oh my God, like I'm not going to be strong. Like I'm not going to be there. And I think that's like, especially like I program in the blocks like blocks, not like week to week, just because I find it's better for a lot of lifters. Like they like seeing like where they're going. They like seeing like the end of block goal. They like seeing how their weights are going up to that. But definitely like meat prep and going into the meat is a little bit of a different animal psychologically. One of the things that I found like just myself is like just like understanding that like nothing really changes. Like at that point, you should have that, like we said the last podcast, training should be predictable, and you
Mhm.
should have a good structure in terms of like load progression in particular. In my opinion, that's going to help set yourself up for that meet. Because I remember like looking over like perks meets like going into IPF Worlds. I know you guys had like more of a heavier intensity block, and it looks like you guys didn't even go above like what like 623 on a deadlift, like going into his meet.
Yeah.
This is like I actually wanted to go over that because like I think something that has been more in my mind that's been like a pet thing for me has been like weekly load progressions. I think that is so important. Especially once you're intermediate and advanced. So when you're a
Mhm.
beginner, it's like you can kind of just doesn't matter what you do. But you've worked with people that are incredibly strong. Perkins is probably like the strongest natural lifter right now. I want to ask you about like how you go about like load progression.
Sure. So I think, everybody's a little bit different when it comes to that. Um, And I think it's going to depend a lot on the lifter's just experience, their actual leverages, as well as something that I think is a little bit underrated of something to look at is how muscular they are. Because in general, those lifters that are very built are going to be able to progress in a different way for somebody who, let's just say, just isn't as built out. Um, leverage oftentimes it will be something that limits a lifter, but when you have more muscle about a lever, you can generally overcome that disadvantage. So that's something that I think you really have to look at. Um, in general, for me, when I'm first starting to work with a lifter, I'll try just kind of the same basic strategy for each lifter as far as progression goes. I'll usually try to make their jumps pretty even across the block, like a usual progression might be, around 3% plus the adjustment for the amount of, weight that they would typically jump each week. Stephen Novi has a great video on that I think most people can check out. I don't want to go through that whole thing because that's a long topic in and of itself. But compared to how they perform in that first block, I'll usually adjust based on what I'm seeing in their ability to get stronger. Usually, you're going to see those really gifted lifters, like you mentioned, Perk. They just kind of need to take big jumps from week to week because um, if you hit them with very small incremental progressions, most of the time they're just going to burn out because that first week would just naturally be very, very heavy for them. I should also mention that when I utilize RPE in my system, it's more of a cap to what I want them to hit rather than a goal. So, if I program, a 6 RPE on week one, if you hit the top end of the range and it's not a 6 RPE, it's not the end of the world. I'm always progressing the lifters through the blocks in such a way that, their week one is ideally some form of overload. Either they're hitting weight that they've hit before even faster, or, in an ideal world, every single week is heavier than what they've done for that week specifically. So as far as designing like the load progression goes, it just kind of depends on how they respond to that first block. And if I see, they're the type of lifter that seems to respond a little bit better to a really big jump on, say, like the week four, then, we'll take that big jump and then we'll kind of scale backwards in a way where those weeks aren't too light that they feel terrible when they start to touch heavy weight. And it just kind of depends on that first block. I sometimes refer to it as a discovery block when I'm talking to new lifters that I take on, because it's just basically like, okay, you've given me all this previous data on you. I have all this previous data on lifters that I've worked with that are of similar size and strength to you. Here's our kind of standard approach. Now we just kind of have to adjust from there. And that's generally how I do it. I think that that's kind of the best way. I think that most people, when they try to customize when they try to customize training for lifters, sometimes they'll try to be a little bit too custom right away. And I think that that's kind of counterproductive. If you try to be just like super duper individualized right away, the problem with that is that sometimes you make the wrong guess and then you have to take a few more blocks before you actually get back into it. So I think it's always good to kind of have a set system that you just make it just different enough based on their previous data, and then adjust from there.
Yeah, I think that you had an interesting point about like number one, like absolute strength is a big factor in that, because you're going to get more and more fatigued, if you're lifting heavier weights. And then as far as like this advantageous thing with like the levers and the muscle, like what comes to mind is like my bench press. Because like I realized that for like myself, and Eric and I talking about this, like everything needs to be like kind of light until like that last week in order
Mhm.
for me to actually like feel good, have like momentum. And then I have to really like respect that RPE 9 cap, because like I can push through it, like I have the muscle on my chest to like do it. But if I go too heavy too fast, like I'm going to really burn out, because like it's just too much fatigue. And then like some lifters, like you can find like they just have everything just move fast, 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 fast. And then they go into that last week and it's really, they can grind it out a little bit more. But they have like 1 week of grinding. And honestly, that's kind of like what I've realized with like myself, like just from experience and trialing the different things. Like that's kind of how I have to be. If I start to like grind in like really anything, it's like crap. Like that's a little bit too much too soon. And so for myself, like just looking over things, just keeping things like that 5 to 7 RPE. And like what you said, I think it's helpful to think of that RPE as like a cap. And you're just setting yourself up for that next week of load progression, next weight. And as long as you hit that week 4 target, or however your the last week is, that's what matters the most. But I do agree with you in the sense of like letting lifters like customize things for like them themselves. Like what did they do? How did they feel? And then working backwards. And a really important thing is to like look at things as just data, especially like as a lifter yourself. You make some issues. You start off too heavy. You grind yourself. Just you basically. I think of blocks as like you have like a runway that you can like make those progress for. They want to make that as long as possible, or like basically until we get to like that good spot, and we can eat that up and peak, hopefully PR. But we want to have that runway set up to like enough time to build where we are in PR territory. And I think that's the main difference between block lengths. I know that Steve Genovi has said that he thinks that's a repeated bout effect. I think that plays some role. I think it's mostly just like how much runway do you need to have to actually like build that into that peak in intensity. And then I've seen with some lifters, like they just do really well with like really small jumps, like
Mhm.
every single week, and they can even like stay like heavier, and they just seemingly like get better. And like I've had some blocks too, like that that worked like that. I will say those have always been like after a quote unquote more of a volume block, because that's how Eric programs. We're like, I remember when last time like a really big spurt of deadlift progress, I literally did like 683, 694, 716, 722. And that block, I was coming off of doing just volume. So I was just adapting to the higher intensity. So there's a lot of like different things that go into the load progression. Um, yeah, like what do you think about that?
I mean, I think that, so are you asking like, what do I think about like smaller jumps, or just
Yeah,
like,
like smaller jumps, or like in terms of like how much does that, like, does it change like if you do like a more of like a block periodization structure, or like if you're doing like more of like that DUP, like not a ton of like quote unquote periodization?
right? So I think it's gonna, with taking smaller jumps, I think it is gonna depend on the lifter. I mean, first of all, like I think at this point we all know, usually smaller females, they're just gonna need those smaller jumps most of the time. Just because if you take too big of jumps, most of the time they'll hit a wall. Like, they might have a week 1 and week 2 that are just crazy easy, and then if you take a big jump, they just, right away. So that's going to be something for sure. But I think the type of lifter that benefits from those smaller jumps, usually, at least in the way that I do things, it's usually more those type of lifters that have just a very short range of motion. Um, I think that a lot of lifters usually, when I see them benefit from those smaller jumps, it's the type of person that like just moves the bar so little that if you go too low when you start the beginning of the block, they're usually not going to be able to handle it as much. And I think to your point, what you mentioned about your own experience with the smaller jumps, I also see some lifters that, like, let's say you structure their training in such a way where they are doing a lot of volume and they're not touching as much, heavy load for whatever reason. I have seen situations where those smaller jumps need to happen just because they're not as adapted to those high end lifts. Um, and just based on how the training's actually been going, maybe that starting point is a little bit different, just based on the fact that you've come off of so much volume. Like you're potentiated in a way that's a little bit different. I'll be honest, I haven't really seen something where somebody will just come off of a volume block and suddenly be ready to hit these like really big numbers right away. But everybody's a little bit different, and I wouldn't be shocked there. I mean, I've seen your deadlift, and I don't necessarily think like you have the smallest range of motion ever, but you definitely have a build that supports something like that. So I can see that working
Yeah.
totally. But I think, yeah, most of the time, I would say smaller jumps kind of fall into that category of like outlier as far as short range of motion goes, at least for me.
Yeah. It's always interesting to me because like I know that we focus a lot on muscle mass in powerlifting. That's a really important thing, especially over the long term. You can never not be focused on gaining muscle. But one of the things I've really been thinking about more often is like, if you're natural, you're built most of your muscle by year 4. If you've been training properly, you've been eating a surplus, whatever. Like I gained like 40 pounds of muscle in my first like 4 years of training, which is pretty good for natural lifter. And I have been thinking about this more often. I think that some people with the volume block thing, they do that in the sense of like, I'm going to be like gain all of this muscle and it's going to significantly increase my strength. And in my opinion, I'm like, well, so let's think about this for a little bit. If you're past that, that beginner or the intermediate stage, we're going more to that late intermediate or more advanced stage. Like if you're spending all that time in volume blocks just for the sake of trying to build as much muscle as possible, especially through the power lifts, which aren't usually the best lifts to build muscle on, I feel like you're missing a lot of the overall bigger picture. Because in my opinion, you can never really get too far away from working at that neural aspect of strength, because like that is like strength is a skill first and foremost, and it's different. There's a lot of different things, and I'm in no way saying muscle mass does not play a big role. Like we know that, but taking too far of a step away from that for the sake of just volume is not the smartest move. And I think that you need to always be trying to incorporate that intensity exposure in some way, shape, or form across the year. Now, obviously, there are times when you can get away from that, and you probably should. Let's say, like after like a meet, like your body is just, mentally too. Like a lot of people are just like, I don't care. Like I just PR, don't want to think about it. But in general, you need to be touching those heavier weights and having like a periodization structure that sort of allows for that. Like some people are more sensitive to that, like singles, like and don't respond to them very well, like year round. But I don't think like you should get too far away from that peak intensity.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I mean, I think we're kind of, at least in the modern era, what you see very often, and it's so funny. I know Matt Cronin talks about this all the time. There are a bunch of people that would laugh because I know I had a number of years ago post go viral about all of the things that Westside got right that was just kind of basically just not applied correctly in the conjugate system. But one of the things that they always emphasized was their accessory work was just balls to the wall all the time. They were trying to be as jacked as possible, but you didn't see that happen on their actual main work, right? Like I would say most modern powerlifting systems ironically are very much a different flavor of what the conjugate system is. It's just applied in a little bit more of a scientific way, in a way that reflects what we know about training now. But to your point, I think that there are going to be certain situations where you do have to get away from that peak intensity for a certain period of time. Like for example, you mentioned Perk before. Like right now, we are doing a block where he's really not touching that intensity as much, with the exception being bench press, just because I think bench just kind of, like you said, you just can't get away from it, But even the peak intensity that we're going for is not quite there, in comparison to what we would do in like the normal first block of a training cycle. So I think for almost mental recovery, is a good time to get away from that. But other than that, yeah, I don't see a point in getting away from it because it literally is the task demand of what we're trying to do. Like we have to be able to move heavy weight. And exactly like you said before, the power lifts just don't support muscle growth as well as people would give them credit for. I think I could see a world in which maybe you design a block structure, like if you really wanted to make a volume block that was actually effective, you could do something where a lifter's just doing very high repetitions to RPE 9 each week, and maybe it's descending over
Yeah.
in terms of the number of reps. Um, but I mean, other than that, like I don't see a world in which a volume block actually does what people think that it does, you know? Just because you're suddenly doing a bunch of high reps and not touching intensity doesn't mean that you're building more muscle. In fact, I would almost argue that if you're going relatively low intensity for the majority of that block, you're probably building less muscle just because you have
100%.
less tension on the muscle from the lack of weight on the barbell. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think for me, and I think we talked about this a little bit on the last podcast as well, but for me, it's always just a shift towards more accessory work in those quote unquote volume blocks. Because honestly, that's going to give you more bang for your buck as far as building tissue. Like I'm almost certain that, just a few grams of extra muscle on your body can translate to kilos over your total. Because yeah, let's face it, as a natural lifter, you're not going to be building a whole lot if you're pretty experienced. But those few grams, if you put the effort in and actually really push the accessory work, that's probably worth it. But I think in terms of wrapping all of that together, I think that the traditional volume blocks don't really need to happen the way that people think they do. They're more just kind of a mental relief more than anything. You scale back on the peak intensity just a little bit, maybe scale up on the accessory intensity during those one or two blocks whenever you want to do that. Maybe include some fun stuff. Like I like to use drop sets and different things like that just to get the athlete really putting the effort in, because sometimes, let's face it, you can say RPE 8 and they're like doing RPE 5 on that.
Yep.
So something to encourage them to actually push that, and then doing that for a couple of blocks, while still having like some kind of intensity exposure is the way that I would typically progress that.
I like what we said. Like the main thing that should change is like the peak intensity, like the relative intensity, and like not like the absolute like necessarily like intensity. You could do like a block of like triples and still say like pretty close, but how that be like an RP like 7.5 cap, and then have more juice for those accessories. And as far as what I'm aware from what the research has said is like peak load does matter for strength. That is what matters the most. It's not like how close it is to failure. That's that peak load. And then proximity to failure matters a lot for muscle growth. And I can look at a lot of powerlifters and how they're built and if they're gaining weight, and I'm like, well, you're not building any muscle. You're probably not training hard on your accessories. Now I will say I do think there is a place for higher up SBD work. For example, I do a ton of that, and that's mostly because for whatever reason, like I seem to be more durable in that 60 to 70% of my max, and it's plenty for me to get stronger. There are absolutely like rep range sensitivities, in my opinion, that are like average like reps that you like respond well to. But you still need to incorporate that heavier loading in some way, shape, or form because that is the sport. I know that data-driven strength likes doing like say they do like a 2x10 and like a volume block, and they do like a 4x5. I think that's too different, in my opinion, than like what you're actually doing. In my opinion, it's just like find like what works with the lifter can like recover from. As long as their singles going up or whatever their E1 or M is going up over time with those heavier weights, I think that you're really getting all that you want from that. Now, obviously, it's good to still experiment with different things, but in my opinion, I feel like with the whole DUP strategy, I feel like, oh man, like my squat block, it's a set of 5, a fatigue single, 2x10, secondary day, set of 3 safety bar squat with 2x6. Like you can kind of get all over the place, in my opinion, with a DUP structure anyways. I feel like that's actually the whole benefit of it is you can do that. You got more varied training. And that's why as you get more and more advanced, it tends to look a little bit more like that. Because like I don't want to have most days be like looking very similar. I think high frequency bench press that can be a little bit different because like you're benching 5 days a week, like you have to have like everything. Like there's no other way. And there's really like less periodization with that. But that's my opinion on it. And like some people like they need more intensity exposure on their secondary day to their primary day, and maybe that's where you put in the higher up volume work because maybe they get more sore from that. Maybe they have more like lingering fatigue, and it makes more sense. Like there's a lots of things to think about when you are programming, across the week with a DP structure.
Yeah, I think that, and all due respect to data-driven strength, Zach was my coach for a number of years. I love him to death, and I think he's fighting the good fight with all the research that he's putting out right now. And not to mention somehow he got Lane Norton healthy again, so props to him. But where I think that application kind of fails to account for individual differences is exactly like what you said. Certain lifters are just going to need more movement per set. If I'm being honest, I've looked into this and there doesn't really seem to be a mechanism for that. And I would be really curious as to see like why it works out that way. Because you would think, provided the load is exactly the same, a 2x10 and a 4x5 would do the same thing. Like on paper, from a muscle growth standpoint, that should do the same thing, because we know that volume is relatively equated, will over time equal pretty similar hypertrophy, but it doesn't seem to be that way with strength. And it's very interesting to me. And I think what that probably comes down to is something to do with individuals' motor patterns. I think for some reason, we just tend to see lifters do better when they're just doing less total sets and more reps and vice versa in different ways. And you, like you sort of mentioned, you do kind of have to sort of go down the if-then tree as far as designing, people's primary and secondary days in that way. Like one of the more common questions that I'll ask my lifters to report in on when they're competing, when they're lifting is how did the movement pattern feel and how strong did you feel on the day? And those two questions most of the time will determine 99% of the changes that I make to programming if I get them. Because if for some reason, they're just consistently feeling a certain way on their primary day and things just aren't trending the way that we want, we have to look at both of those things. Generally speaking, if the weight is feeling, quite heavy on their back, then you're probably not giving them enough heavy exposure on the secondary day. And if the movement pattern just feels really bad and they can't put that together, then they probably need a little bit more work on the secondary day. And then from there, you can just kind of go down, different paths as far as the way that you adjust, based on what you've typically seen work for that lifter as well as other lifters of similar strength. And I think it's very interesting too, because you also have to be quite careful. I know one of the things that you wanted to really discuss was kind of just load progression over the course of a lifter's career. And I think that that's something that you really have to respect when it comes to adjusting the primary and secondary days. Like one of the things that I keep track of tonnage, not for the sake of hypertrophy, but actually just respecting risk of injury. I've noticed that for a lot of lifters, if you really see this huge increase in tonnage all of a sudden, that's usually when injury risk goes up. So for me, over time, I'm always trying to make sure that as we're progressing a lifter long-term through their career, that their tonnage doesn't see this huge spike over time. And I think when it comes to primary and secondary days, it can be really easy to just be like, oh yeah, they're not feeling as good. Let's just add another set of 10. And then you suddenly think like, oh, that set of 10 is this much tonnage. There's a pretty good chance that all of a sudden that spike in tonnage can mess with their ability to recover and, maybe even increase injury risk. So that's something that I'm really careful with. My sheet kind of tracks tonnage in the background, and I'm always just paying attention to that. And if I start to see, any sort of downturn in performance, that's one of the first things that I'll open the tonnage tracker and just be like, okay, this might have been a little bit too much, or maybe even too little. Suddenly, we're coming back from a competition or something like that, and the tonnage is just lower and they're just not feeling it. Okay, we need to maybe bump up the work a little bit more that way too. And I think just seeing a nice linear graph of tonnage over the course of your career, if you have the ability to actually track that, which let's face it, we don't all have the ability, but at least over a course of a lifter's time with me, that's what I generally like to see, and that keeps them progressing well. I find at least. Uh, Not that I'm ever going to like massively push tonnage on purpose. I'm not much of the really just like push someone super hard and then pull them back type of guy. But yeah, as long as I'm seeing that graph be pretty linear over time, we're doing something right in my opinion.
It's interesting that you said that because I fully agree. But on the podcast I had with Sean Noriega, he disagreed, or he didn't think that tonnage was a very important training variable to track in general. And I think that like his argument was that like training should be similar enough over time, or like you shouldn't like really need to pay attention to that or like track it. But like maybe if things aren't going right, like that's when you need to look at tonnage and see like is that different from blocks that have gone well. But like I do think that it matters. I mean, hell, I was even talking with Eric about this. Like this is like 2 years ago, but something it stuck out with me. And he was like, I was like, do we need a ever at like volume, like a set, like my squat or like whatever? It was like there would be sometimes I've noticed like blocks you can go from like a 3x8 on a secondary day to a 3x7 to a 4x6. I'm like, are you trying to like maintain tonnage, or is that like just because like the volume is like lower and you don't really want my relative intensity or my loading to be higher on those sets, just like have the same amount of tonnage, but less like, intensity or relative in intensity. And his response to that was that he just mostly like, if I'm getting stronger, like that's going to take care of most of the tonnage. And if anything is going to see is like this, volume might need to go down, especially for like the SPD or frequency sometimes. But I do think that tracking that matters because it's really good data about like, okay, well, does my training week like look similar enough? Especially like if you're making changes, like when I just changed like my split, I like calculated everything. I'm like, where are my best blocks? What did they do? What were the overall tonnage? Maybe I go back to that in some, in similar structure. Um, is it the end all be all? No, but it's something that you should be aware of, in my opinion, especially for that injury risk factor.
Right. Yeah, and to be clear, like that's definitely not the first thing that I'm going to look at if somebody is suddenly doing poorly. But I do keep a pretty keen track on that, especially like I mentioned, during those blocks where maybe I'm pushing accessory work a little bit harder for a lifter. I even have trackers that actually look at that. Because again, if all
I
of a
think for
sudden,
accessories, it matters more, to be honest with you.
yeah,
Like a lot more, because I think a lot of times people will get into this trap where like, especially on accessories, and people don't powerlifters don't know how to program for bodybuilding. That's just like the thing. They don't realize like if I'm doing like my rep set on like all my accessories, that's so much more like effective reps or so much more like, the actual tonnage in my opinion going towards that muscle growth as opposed to like not. And also like I think that like also for like powerlifting, like hypertrophy too. I don't like going above like 12 reps on compounds. Like I actually like going more towards like that 10, that 8 to 10.
Mhm.
Um, but like on a single joint, like just going higher and doing that. But I do think for accessories it matters more than the actual comp movements because like if you visit the same coach over time, it's probably not going to look that much different if things are working.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I think paying attention to that is a little bit more important in terms of, variables with that. And again, like to your point, tonnage increasing over time, like that shouldn't be something that you like actively try to push, in my opinion. It should be a result of you getting stronger. But again, I think it's important to look at that tonnage in the accessory work, particularly on the muscle groups that are most related to the competition lifts. Because if you aren't pushing those as hard, then more than likely you're probably not going to see as much strength gain, right? Because you're just not adding as much tissue as you could. And also, if again, like let's say you're in that volume block and you push it way too hard and suddenly everybody's, tanking, you're like, okay, well, obviously most of the time, most powerlifting accessory work is, at least on paper, supposed to be pushed, right? To a certain degree. So if that's equated across blocks, if generally speaking, like you're on average taking most accessories to RPE 8 on average, then what else could you look at if suddenly performance is dropping and all the competition lifts are, where they should be? Oh, well, okay, let's look at the tonnage on all of your pushing accessory movements. Oh my gosh, that went up so much. You've been progressing that a ton. Maybe we need to pull back on that. Just little things like that. Or I think it's something that people very easily overlook. And as a result of that, I think they'll make a ton of changes that just don't actually need to be made. So I think that's a good thing to just kind of, check off the list of things like, okay, did we make sure that accessory work isn't being pushed too little or too hard at this time?
I think that's another like reason why like you shouldn't change accessories a ton. Because if you add in like a new like movement, like say like you haven't done like a flat dumbbell bench press after your actual comp bench ever, and then you add that in, and you're going to be seeing rapid skill improvement, strength increases on that. Like you might actually see a lag on like your bench strength, um, like because of that. That's also why it can be important to like like find movements that aren't going to be super interfering with that. One thing that I've been doing like the whole tier list thing on like exercise selections. I think that's just something that does matter. A lot of people just don't understand exercise selection and how it transfers over to powerlifting, especially as from an accessory or resistance movement standpoint. Um, I think that like I think it's like you want to keep in like the same like say like compound accessories the entire time. I think you can phase in and out like more like the single joint stuff and get more away with it over time, especially like I will sometimes even just drop those in a peaking block because it's just like how much is it actually gonna help out at that point? Probably not a ton. Um, but yeah, I think that's a good thing to just sort of think about. So I guess I want to ask too, um, we've talked about this a little bit about block prioritization and like and whatnot, but I want to ask like, do you think that I guess in your system, like, do you vary training a lot over time, or meaning do you have like different blocks and basically find like, say you have a macrocycle and you have a 3 block sequence and you sort of find that and you keep that the same over time, or do you sort of change that over time, or maybe you're slightly changing like the down set, or maybe you like the top set, maybe instead of doing like 3-2-1, you do 4-2-1, and then maybe instead of doing down sets of 6, you do down sets of 5. How varied should that be, or should we just kind of find like what works and keep that?
So, I mean, my answer is always going to be find what works and keep it personally. Just because I think if somebody's staying healthy and seeing progress, like the grass is not always greener. Like as a much younger coach, I think I made that mistake a lot. I think I just had this opinion that like, oh, the competition's over. Let's try all this new stuff. And don't get me wrong, like I think there needs to be room for experimentation. Like maybe I'm a little too excited here because I keep bringing up Perk. Him winning worlds is a pretty big
I
milestone
mean,
for
that's a
my
huge deal.
career. Yeah. But like right now, our block that we're running has probably the most variation from the norm that we've done in a long time, just because we had some thoughts post worlds that we wanted to test out. But even those little changes are not massive differences from what we typically do. And I think that the key here is when you're going to make changes, one, obviously there needs to be a reason for it, right? And two, they need to be small and incremental. Because one, it could just be too much shock to the lifter, and then you just might not get good data. But more importantly, if you make big sweeping changes, how are you going to know what's actually working if it does? You know, like if this is an entirely new structure, that has no similarity to what you've done previously, then what works? How do you know that that is working? So generally speaking, yeah, like if we're talking, say, like a macrocycle with 3 individual blocks, I'm usually going to find what works and stick to it. Um, I'm generally going to, if we're doing, an actual competition at the end of that, the only big difference is that you might see me, the last week put in some room to adjust for, some kind of difference in training leading up to a competition. Like, just as an example, if a lifter's traveling internationally, like that might be something that I have to adjust for, or just travel in general. Like, if they're traveling on a day that they would typically be training, I'll have to adjust for little things like that. But for the most part, it's always the same. And that might be a little bit of a boring answer, but sometimes, boring is what gets you there.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Because I think there's a lot of people that might be newer to what I would call good powerlifting coaching. There are less changes made than lifter might like or might be used to in the past that they've worked with, other coaches that are less qualified, don't really track data as much. This is one of the mistakes I've even made too. Like I always try to change like the accessories, or I try to change a lot of stuff earlier on. Is I'm like, if I don't change things, my clients are going to figure out like what's going on. And my job security is gone. And then I kind of realized, like, as long as my clients are making progress, that's what matters. And I think that a training boss can be meaningfully different enough if you've PR'd at the very end of it, and just by upping that training max a little bit, and using that. And then it's like you said, the grass isn't always greener. Um, and I think you can like rerun blocks and blocks, especially if your life is very, very consistent with the outside variables. I think sometimes when I might want to change that is if a lifter is having very inconsistent outside variables, things have changed from that perspective, where you might need to like change things with, like their overall training structure, or low progression, or average intensity. But again, like those are all very small changes, that don't really need to be changed. Don't really need to be addressed for very, very often. And in my opinion, anyways, if you're a powerlifter, like if you have a really hectic job that you have a crazy schedule, it changes like all the time, like, and this is something that really matters to you, it might be worth even getting a different job or looking into that so that you can actually maximize your training. Obviously, I know that not everybody has that luxury, but if it's something that really does matter to you, the more consistent that your outside variables can be, then the more consistent that training like response can be. Because like I always tell people, like the only blocks that go bad for me really are blocks where my outside variables were controlled as well. And those are usually when I have to make changes on the fly, or
Yeah.
communicate to like Eric and whatever. But yeah, I am in agreement with you. And I think I find like that, let's say like, an 8 to 12 week, that like blocks structure that like works well. Like for example, Eric likes doing, like, he wrote the intermediate approach. That's kind of how he like prefers to periodize things, is like higher volume block intensity, higher volume block in intensity, and we keep things very, very similar. But maybe things like change depending on how close we are to like a meet with, like, are we doing singles or not, or is it like doubles or whatever. But I think that finding a structure like that, also, like, I think powerlifters also like, with how we think, I like knowing, okay, this is probably what's going to happen. I don't like having things change all the time. It rocks my world, and I'm like, I like, if something went well, I like clinging to that and riding that until it stops working.
Right. Yeah, I think so. As far as like little like subtle differences that you'll see across blocks that I write, um, you'll obviously see the top sets change. I think for the majority of people out there that are used to that top set back down approach, you'll typically see those change. One of the things that I've started doing since the last time that we had a podcast, that I think has worked quite well. Generally, like, we sort of talked about how some lifters will respond to certain rep ranges better than others. So what I try to do at the start of a new training cycle, when their training maxes have changed and all that, I will start at the lowest effective percentage of 1RM for their back downs. And I will try to milk that all the way through the training cycle as best I can. And when I see that the last set RPEs of those back downs are getting too high, that's when I'll then go to the next rep range and bump down the intensity and keep going from there. And usually, if done correctly, the entire training cycle, our back downs can stay exactly the same. Like, you might see a structure where the top set, we'll just say we start off with triples. So block one is just triples. And then let's say for whatever reason, this lifter is really responsive to sevens. Okay. And then we have an auto-regulated top set of 7 with a range. And then the back downs are a set percentage of 1RM. And they are the lowest possible effective percentage. And then we just progress that all the way through the entire training cycle. And that seems to work really well for the majority of the people that I work with. And then I won't really adjust that until either we get to the end of the training cycle and their maxes are now higher. Then I'll just kind of keep milking that. Or like I said, until the last set RPEs are getting too high, then I'll usually bump it down and go from there.
Where do you like to cap the last RPE, like say on like squat, deadlift, and bench?
If we're talking just back downs, generally speaking, if I'm seeing more than 2 weeks where somebody goes above an 8 RPE, then I'll take that as a sign that we need to bump that down.
Yeah, I'm very similar. Bench press, my cap is usually in 8, and then for squat, deadlift, I try not having be above like a 7. So this is a good question. Also with the varied training, do you like periodizing like that relative intensity exposure? So like say like RPE 8, for like most of your training, and then you go like RPE 9 or like even like a 10, because I think that this is something I've also thought about too, because we know that basically at higher intensities are disproportionately fatiguing. They're not better for building strength. But I also know there's a lot of value to also touching those near max singles, or near max loads that requires because basically like there are changes in like loading demands and shifting weights and understanding like how to actually grind through a rep, or what happens to your body at certain like relative intensities. Like I can actually tell on deadlift and squat that was above an RPE 8 if I have to use like my lower back more. But that's how the loading demands shift for me. But how do you like periodizing that, or do you like keeping it more in like a certain intensity the entire time?
Honestly, it really just kind of depends on the lifter. To me, I think there's going to be, and are we talking top sets or just everything overall?
Top sets, top sets.
So I think in the case of top sets, it really just kind of depends on the lifter's ability to adapt to heavy loads. Like, just as an example, I know, like, I have some lifters that I can give triples to, and we can work up to, an RPE 9. But if for whatever reason, if we go to doubles and I program an RPE 9 at the end of the block, their chance of failing is that much higher. Because for whatever reason, that extra bump in intensity plus having to do like, one more rep after doing a single, that seems to be just the sweet spot of where it's too much for them. So it kind of depends on the lifter. And again, that kind of goes back into the whole like biomechanics side of things. Like if you're just, not built to squat super well, I might give you 2 blocks of triples and then singles, or, a block of triples and then 2 blocks of singles. Like it just kind of depends on how you handle that individual lift. I also think like, in the case of bench press, you do sort of have to periodize that relative intensity. Most of the lifters that I work with are usually going to be doing singles on bench press year round. But obviously you can't push to an RP 9, 10 single every single block. Some younger lifters that I might get, like if I'm working with a teenager, most of the time they can probably do that. But if you're a more experienced lifter, that's just not going to happen. So I find it can be really useful to kind of look at bench press and say, okay, we're only going to push to an RPE, 7.5 in the first block. And then because of that, because that peak intensity is lower, like we talked about earlier, we can really push the accessory work, right? And then as we lower the intensity of the accessory work, we can then push the peak intensity of the bench press. Let's say we go up to, an 8 the next block. And then if we're ending the block, we go up to, or excuse me, if we're ending the cycle, we go up to a 9 the final block. It's a lot easier to kind of work with it in that way. But like I said, everybody's a little bit different. Everybody handles intensity a little bit differently. And that's going to come back to your leverages, your experience, the amount of muscle on your body, all that type of stuff.
Yeah, this is why it's so important, especially like as you really want to be good at the sport. Like coaching is has to be collaborative. You have to be thinking about your training a lot. You have to be thinking about what went well, what didn't go well, what trends do I notice? Because like you said, there are lifters that they can hit RP9 like block after block after block, and they they're fine. Hell, even like a 9.5. Like my friend Caleb, extremely strong, like 760 deadlift, 430 bench, and a 727 squat, and like he can push an RPE 9.5 like every single block, and he's fine. He can come back again and do it again, like a 3-2-1 approaching, and he's fine. Whereas for myself, what Eric and I have noticed is that if I have a block where I push things, the next block I have to pull back because it takes me that much time to feel good again. And sort of finding that peak intensity exposure that like works well for you. It still is important to touch those like nines or something like that. That is the sport, but doing it in a way that maximizes like building momentum and maintaining momentum. Because like I also think you also have to like ask yourself, like especially if you're in like a prep scenario, am I in a spot where like I need to build momentum going into this meet, or am I in a spot where like say like one of my favorite things to do is have 2 blocks of singles, say or hell even like maybe 3, but basically have like one heavier block where it's like we're getting into your max single, and then maybe like an RPE 9 that is a really good like indicator, and then going into the block that meet block prop, it's like okay, maybe go up to like an opener or in between an opener and a second attempt, and that
Yeah.
seems to work really really well. And then lining up that meet week with the actual peak week of your block, because like I found it so much harder to like maintain like performance if you try doing it like the traditional heaviest week of block, like week 4, and then you try to like hold it on for like another week. It's like
Yeah.
we're trying to make the weakest week feel strongest. That
Yeah.
doesn't make any sense to me. But I've seen that work very 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 well for a lot
Yeah.
of lifters.
You mentioned how with Perk, how he talked about how we'll typically only work up to his deadlift opener as his heaviest pull in his block before comp, and yeah, that's exactly true. I also think that when we're talking specifically squat and deadlift, I think that because those two lifts have an effect on one another in terms of how they perform, especially when you get super advanced lifters, you can you could see that structure working even better when you apply it. Like just as an example, so for Perk, we always do his heaviest pull one block out because one, he's for whatever reason. Well, actually, not to plug things too early, but I do have a full case study on Perk coming out on this coming Monday.
Oh yeah.
I'm finishing the process of editing right now, so that'll be posted on Monday. But just to as a little preview to that, so like I said, we take his heaviest pull one block out, and I think that works out for multiple reasons. One, his squats he's very rep sensitive, so we typically need a combination of heavy weight and reps in order to get his squat to move. So at that time, when we're one block out, we're not touching his heaviest squat weights yet. So because of that, he can express strength a little bit better on pulls. But then when we go into the block of the meet, that's when our heaviest squats are hitting. So naturally, deadlift kind of is going to take a hit from that. So it just makes more sense for us to just only work up to his heaviest weight being around his opener. And that seems to then, in the opposite way, then potentiate squats because he doesn't have as much fatigue from pulls that way. And that seems to work out. I will say, and I can't remember if Perk has talked about this publicly or not, but for the first time ever in a prep since he has started to hit that wave, he did actually miss his last heavy squat before Worlds. But that was, I think, more due to external factors. He went from training in an air-conditioned gym to that gym
Oh God,
not
don't
having
get me
equipment.
started,
So the weight was
dude.
literally falling off his back. It was pretty
The
bad.
the heat is such a it taints training. Like
Mhm.
it's so bad. Like my gym, like we do have AC, but the circulation isn't good. Like it'll get to be like when it gets to 100 degrees, it's like 85, 90 degrees in the gym. It sucks. But
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
like going over that, like man, like the interplay between squat and deadlift is always fascinating to me too. Like figuring out like, and this is why like I always think like squat is it should be prioritized. Like that is like the lift that needs to be prioritized in powerlifting because so many people their squat goes up, their deadlift's going to go up. In a
Mhm.
lot of cases, as long as they're training sufficiently heavy enough. And one of my favorite low progression strategies too, with especially and this is one of the things that I'm trying out. This far I've seen it work well for lifters. I coach are similarly others to me, keeping squat a tad bit heavier during the block and keeping deadlift a tad bit lighter. And then that last week, it seems to like make deadlift like hang around longer and they have a big peak on both of them. Because like especially for those more like those eccentrically loaded movements like the squat and the bench press, those tend to need more intensity.
Mhm.
Because there's more of a component to feeling the weight in your hands for longer on a bench press, having to hold it there. Squat, you unrack it, you walk it out. You have to sit there, wait for the start command, and then go all the way down, hit everything right, and then go back up. Whereas a deadlift is like, as long as your starting position is good, you're probably going to be fine.
Yeah. And I think that to your point, I think one of the other reasons why pulls tend to progress well when you let them lag back is for that exact reason. Because you're actually not touching as heavy of weight, your skill practice with the start position is better, right? You're not putting yourself in situations where your start position might change nearly as much. And as a result of that, we'll just say, neurological integration is, in my opinion, going to be better. And that way you kind of see this big upswing. One of my favorite block structures for, I would say, we'll say middle to heavyweight men, is running a 5-week block structure where squat only progresses for 4 weeks, and then we technically sort of deload slash taper it on the fifth week, and then pulls we go all 5 weeks, and then that way we just constantly see this upswing in performance. And it's exactly as you said. We kind of hold it back during those 4 weeks, and then boom, big upswing in performance, and that seems to be, I don't know, just the not that there's a silver bullet in powerlifting for anything, but for a lot of lifters that have reasonably big deadlifts, I think that that's a great way to structure training.
Yeah, the only thing that gets hard with that, especially I've done that too, is like peaking and like figuring out like how are they going to like peak well. But I also think like it does sort of take care of itself is if like on the week 4, like if it the heavier like basically you can just take that the week 4 loading that you would usually have going into that week 5, and that sets them up for that PR, and
Mhm.
that, and they're probably going to be okay with when they go into the actual competition. Um, I think peaking is like it's still one of those things that's just like we don't know a lot about it, but I think they're getting a lot better at it. Right now, we're seeing a lot more consistent performances. I think it's because we're not prioritizing like that whole super compensation thing anymore. Like there
Yeah.
definitely is like a way to like there definitely is people that go up. I would also argue though, like for me, it's just like that the meet environment for me. Like I'm very extroverted, and that increases my performance. Whereas I've seen lifters who are like even though they're quote unquote peaked and tapered, they get really nervous and they do worse because of that.
Right. Yeah, I think there's definitely a mental aspect, all the adrenaline. And I don't, the number of lifters that like I don't know that I'd have enough time to name all the lifters that I know that just get absolutely cracked out on caffeine on meet day, whereas they probably don't normally do that in the gym. So there's a number of factors there that I
I
think.
think that a caffeine thing too, Joe. Like I've seen that, like if some people like overdo it too much on squat, and they have this huge come down by like bench press. And they're like, I'm so tired now, and then it also takes them their deadlift a little bit because they got like so like that sympathetic drive was like so high, and it's hard to like stay up, especially for like a. I think USAPL like Worlds meet is it's faster. Talking 4 hours that you can get away with it, talking WRPF, USPA, like you're gonna be there for a while. Like that can really tank you. Like I've
Yeah.
always and like I've always like signaled that to my USPA or WRPF lifters. I'm like, hey, like you better bring a tent because like you're gonna be here for a while. Um, don't overdo the caffeine. Um, try to keep it like more like a steady like trickle throughout the meet, and then you can like bump it up by like bench or deadlift. But that's something else to like also consider. I
Yeah,
also think
that's
like not
true.
like overly like relying on caffeine for like your peak for performance too. If that is like what your meet competition is going to be like that's also important.
Oh yeah, my stand. If we're talking caffeine, and don't get me like I say that as I'm sipping on an energy drink right now. My stance on caffeine, as I've coached more and more lifters, has kind of changed big time. To your credit, I think that you're 100% right. Like it's very different in the untested scene where they'll just do a lot of flights, and in the break between lifts is just so much longer. Like yeah, that would not work well. I coach a handful of untested lifters. My guy, Omar Villegas, got third at the Ghost Clash this past competition,
It's great.
and yeah, he did really well. It was pretty cool that the only two people stronger than him at that comp were Jamal and John
Yeah, it's
Hack.
pretty dope. Yeah.
But yeah, that was something that I recall us just sort of discussing as like a one-off thing. Like, yeah, we got to make sure that we're careful with our caffeine intake. But moreover, I think that I think it was Menno Henselmans that posted something about this. There was a recent paper that was done that said the optimal time to take your pre-workout where it doesn't disturb your sleep at all is 13 hours before bedtime. And
Yeah.
anything after that, and you're going to get less quality sleep. So I don't know. My stance on the use of caffeine, like don't get me wrong, ergogenic aids are just kind of an important part of like supplementation at this point. Like it's something that definitely can give you some kind of a boost, but you got to be smart with it. Sometimes it might be worth it to just allow your recovery to be a little bit better. You'd probably get stronger in the long term.
That's a big change I made with my training. Is I used to always be like, there's like the ultra like high fatigue, and like I think also like by the way, as you get like more advanced, like I told Eric this last check, and I think I just have to accept I'm going to feel like crap a lot, and that's just part of my goals. Is that powerlifting is hard, training is hard. As long as that's managed, I'm getting stronger. I don't care, but I lowered down my caffeine a lot, to like the point where like I will rarely have more than 200 milligrams going into a training session, and outside of it, it's like I keep it to like 100, and that's like if I feel like I didn't sleep well or whatever. But like that's such a big game changer for like my like recovery on my performance seems to be like more predictable too, and like I'm less mentally amped because like I get a lot from like the mental arousal. I'm a very mental lifter in that sense. Like if I feel good, I feel like recovered. That's what matters, not like how much caffeine I'm taking or whatever. Like if I feel like okay, these are moving well, I'm fast, my technique feels good, that's what I need to like actually know I'm feeling strong, not like feeling like my heart rate is 120 beats per minute resting.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think I kind of fall a little bit more into the if I get really hyped, well, actually I think it unfortunately it kind of changes from lift to lift. With squat and bench press, if you like let me loose and I'm just like, I don't know, mindless about it, generally I do better. But with pulls, if I get too hyped, I'm gonna miss. I'm gonna miss
I
super
get
hard.
It's so interesting talking about that. It's like for me, it's like I don't get like outwardly hyped, but like internally, like I do best like I get mad. Like if
Right.
I'm like fuck this weight, like then I do so much better. But it's like that actual like allows me to like also like keep my technique a little bit better too than like it's supposed to like freaking out and whatever. But everybody's different. I think that's important to actually practice in training, figuring out how do you lift like the best, especially in like that in that week 4, and really just being intentional about that. But I think I think this was a pretty good conversation.
For sure.
I want to thank you so much for coming on again. It's like I was looking over the podcast scene. I'm like, man, there's just not many podcasts in the States that just talk about like actual programming. So
Yeah.
it's always a blast to like have these conversations with coaches I respect a lot. So people want to hire you for coaching or follow you, where should they head?
So at the moment, I do actually have two openings, and I'm going through my wait list right now. It's I'm very, very blessed to say that I have kind of a long wait list. But if somebody does want to throw their hat in the ring, they can email me. It's Joe at one, the number one, repmethods.com. That is my brand. If I get back to you and say, hey, those spots are full, I will be happy to add you to the wait list. But I will say there's quite a lot of lifters there. But I'm willing to work with anybody as long as we get along. But I'm really selective these days. I keep a much smaller roster, only 30 people, and I will not go over that number. I do offer programming only, so if I am full, that would be the only other way that you might be able to work with me. All of that said, you can also follow me at One Rep Methods on Instagram. And just to plug my own project, which is actually inspired a little bit by your podcast. We discussed this a long time ago.
Yeah.
I have a podcast that I'm finally picking back up after a number of months called One Rep More. So that's kind of meant to be a masterclass on powerlifting. So if there was a university course on powerlifting, this would be it. There will be a new episode going live on Monday at at least on the podcast apps, it'll be really early in the morning, like 5 a.m. And then the video version will be going live on my YouTube channel at noon Eastern Standard Time. So you can find all that if you'd like find me on Instagram. The links to that are there. But it'll be, like I said, a full case study of Perk. A lot of people have been asking me about his training, so I figured, he just won Worlds. Now is a good time to do it. So all of that will be available if you guys want to check that out.
I'll make sure I include all those details in the show notes. If you guys are lucky enough to work with Joe, you'll be very lucky. So I'll talk to you guys in the next episode.